At 11:47 on a Thursday night, my daughter stood barefoot in our kitchen, holding her phone as if it had become something dangerous. "Mom," Sophie said, "the man the DNA site says is my grandfather is Conrad Ashcroft." I knew the name before she turned the screen toward me. Everyone in western Pennsylvania knew it. Ashcroft Steel had built bridges, rail lines, hospitals, and most of the glass towers along the river. Conrad Ashcroft was 82 years old, worth more money than I could picture, and famous for giving interviews from an office lined with photographs of the son he had lost before I was born. The test did not say distant cousin. It showed 24.8% shared DNA within the range of a grandparent. I was still staring at the number when my phone rang. The caller was Miriam Cole, the quiet probate lawyer who had handled my mother's estate 8 months earlier. Miriam had never called me after 6 in the evening. "Evelyn," she said, without greeting me, "has Sophie recently taken a DNA test?" The room seemed to narrow around me. When I asked how she knew, Miriam was silent for 2 breaths. Then she said, "Your mother left a sealed instruction. It was to be opened if anyone connected to the Ashcroft family ever contacted you, or if genetic evidence brought that family to your door." I looked at Sophie, at the little blue progress circle still spinning beside Conrad Ashcroft's initials, and felt the past moving beneath our house like a fault line. "Do not reply to the match," Miriam said. "Do not speak to a family representative. And if someone arrives before morning, do not let them inside." Before I could ask why, headlights swept across my kitchen wall. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Nora again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Evelyn Shaw. I was 46 when this happened, and I worked in revenue integrity for a community hospital in Pittsburgh. Most days, I compared medical records to billing codes, looking for the small discrepancies that could turn a correct invoice into a dangerous one. I had learned that expensive mistakes rarely introduce themselves with alarms. They hid in ordinary places: a date entered 1 day late, a duplicate charge, a missing signature, a code that almost matched the procedure but did not. My job was to slow down when everyone else wanted to move quickly. That habit would eventually save my daughter and me. At the time, however, my life was quiet enough to seem settled. Sophie was 21 and studying nursing at a state university 40 minutes away. She lived with me to save money and worked weekend shifts at a bakery. We shared a narrow brick house with a porch that leaned slightly toward the street and a backyard where my mother had planted lavender. I had been divorced for 9 years. My former husband, David, lived in Ohio and called Sophie on birthdays and some holidays. Our marriage had thinned slowly under gambling debts, secret credit cards, and the exhaustion of loving someone who treated every promise as a payment he could postpone. My mother, Ruth Bell, had helped me rebuild. She was not a woman who gave speeches. She arrived with groceries, folded towels while I cried, and taught Sophie how to grow tomatoes in bad soil. She had worked most of her life as a payroll clerk, first for a manufacturing company and later for a school district. Numbers comforted her. She said they did not become kinder when you ignored them, but they did become clearer when you wrote them down. She died after a short illness the previous November. Her estate had been modest: a bungalow, $17,000 in savings, an old Buick, and boxes of carefully labeled receipts. I was her only child. There had been no reason for a sealed instruction involving one of the wealthiest families in America. Sophie had taken the DNA test because of a college genetics assignment. She had always been curious about my father, whom I had never known. My birth certificate named no father, and my mother's answer never changed. "He was young," she would say. "He died before he could become part of our lives." If I pressed, her expression closed like a ledger at the end of a long day. I assumed the story carried pain she had earned the right to keep. 3 weeks after Sophie uploaded her results, the site found a close family comparison in a private research account. The profile showed only CA, and an account administered by Ashcroft Family Heritage LLC. Sophie searched corporate registrations and an interview in which Conrad mentioned providing DNA for a family history project. By dinner, she had a name: By midnight, someone else apparently knew she had found it. The headlights outside belonged to a black sedan parked across the street. The engine remained running. I turned off the kitchen light and moved away from the window. Sophie whispered, "Do you think that's them?" "I think we do exactly what Miriam said." I called her back. She instructed us to pack overnight bags and drive to her office using the rear alley. She would meet us there with a security guard. I asked if I should call the police. "If the person approaches the house." "Yes," she said. "For now, I need you to understand that their presence may be intended to frighten you, not harm you. Fear makes people answer questions they should take time to understand." That sounded like something my mother might have told her. We left through the basement door 10 minutes later. Sophie carried her laptop. I took my mother's old metal recipe box without knowing why. It was the place where she had kept important phone numbers, appliance warranties, and, once, the cash she gave me to hire a divorce attorney. Miriam's office occupied the second floor of a converted house near the courthouse. At 1 in the morning, its lamps made warm squares against the dark. Miriam met us at the back entrance, wearing navy trousers, a cream sweater, and the same sensible shoes she had worn to my mother's funeral. On her conference table sat a thick envelope. Across the front, in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "For Evelyn, only when the Ashcrofts find her." I recognized the careful pressure of every letter. Miriam explained that my mother had come to see her 6 years earlier, not for estate planning, but for advice about documents she had preserved since 1979. She had refused to make any accusation without proof. She had also refused to let Miriam contact me. She believed attention from that family could put pressure on your marriage and your work, Miriam said. She wanted you to have a normal life unless the truth became impossible to contain. My marriage was already falling apart 6 years ago. She knew. Inside the envelope was a safe deposit key, a notarized affidavit, and a photograph of my mother at 19. She was standing as a young man in front of an old stone greenhouse. His face stopped my breath. He had my eyes, not similar eyes, mine. On the back, my mother had written, "Thomas Ashcroft, May 1978, Bellwether House." Thomas was Conrad Ashcroft's only son. He had died at 24 when a small company plane crashed during a storm. Newspaper photographs showed Conrad walking behind the coffin, one hand pressed to his wife's back. The tragedy had become part of the Ashcroft mythology. The lost heir, the grieving father, the company built in his memory. According to my mother's affidavit, she met Thomas while working in the bookkeeping office at Bellwether House, the Ashcroft family's country property. He was completing an engineering apprenticeship and trying, unsuccessfully, to persuade his father that he wanted to design safer factories instead of managing acquisitions. Their relationship lasted 11 months. She learned she was pregnant 4 days before his final flight. Thomas knew. He wrote that he would tell his father as soon as he returned. He never returned. After the funeral, my mother sent Conrad Ashcroft a letter. 3 days later, a lawyer named Edwin Cross visited her parents' house. He told her that Thomas had been engaged to another woman, that public scandal would destroy his mother, and that the Ashcrofts would contest any claim. He offered money. My mother refused. 2 weeks later, Cross returned with what he claimed was a message from Conrad. If she agreed never to contact the family, her child would be protected through a private trust. Frightened and grieving, she signed an acknowledgement stating only that she had received legal information. She was not given a copy. No money ever came. The affidavit ended with a sentence that made my hands shake. I did not tell Evelyn because in 1987, Edwin Cross warned me that a false paternity claim could cost me custody of her. In 2014, his son Adrian contacted my former son-in-law David Shaw. I believe David accepted money in exchange for information and a sample of Sophie's DNA. "Dad knew?" Sophie asked. Miriam did not soften the answer. "We don't know what he knew. We know Ruth believed he was paid." The first betrayal had come from my mother's silence. The second came from a man I had once trusted to protect our child. We waited in a small airport hotel until the bank opened. I did not sleep. Sophie lay on the other bed with her face turned toward the wall. At one point she said, "If he sold my DNA, does that mean everything about us was a lie?" "No," I told her. "It means one decision he made may have been a lie. We are going to find out which one." My work had taught me not to code an entire hospital stay from one troubling line in a chart. A fact could be serious without being complete. That distinction was the narrow handrail I held through the night. The safe deposit box contained no valuables. It held 37 letters from Thomas, a payroll ledger, my mother's certified mail receipt, a cassette recording, a notebook, and a yellowed document titled Contingent Descendant Trust of Thomas C. Ashcroft. Miriam put on cotton gloves before touching it. The trust had been created by Conrad in February 1980, 9 months after my birth. It named Edwin Cross as trustee and directed him to locate the child connected to Thomas C. Ashcroft's intended family obligation as described in the confidential memorandum. The assets were to support that child's education and health, then transfer in stages. If the child could not be located, the money was to remain invested for any descendants until 2040. The initial funding was $2 million. Sophie stared at the page. What would that be worth now? Miriam looked at me instead of her. Depending on management and withdrawals, considerably more. It was the first moment money entered the room, and I disliked what it did to the air. I told Miriam I did not want an estimate yet. I wanted to know whether the document was authentic. She nodded, almost approvingly. That is the correct first question. The cassette was labeled June 12, 1987. We found an old player in the bank manager's office. After a hiss of static, my mother's younger voice filled the room. She had recorded a meeting with Edwin Cross. He was calm, educated, and unfailingly polite. He never said he would take me away. He said child welfare investigations were unpredictable, that unmarried mothers could be portrayed unfairly, and that paternity disputes attracted people who profited from humiliation. Then he told her the Ashcroft family had conducted appropriate testing and determined that I could not be Thomas's child. My mother asked for the test result. Cross said it was privileged. She asked how they had tested a child from whom no sample had been taken. There was a 6-second silence. Then Cross said, "Ruth, I am trying to help you preserve the decent life you have managed to build." It was not a threat in the language of threats. That was what made it effective. My mother's notebook recorded dates and descriptions of men she believed had watched our childhood home. The entries stopped in 1988 and resumed 26 years later. March 4, 2014, David asked what blood type Thomas had. March 19, David took Sophie to a school health fair that school confirms did not exist. April 2, David deposited funds and paid mortgage arrears. April 8, gray sedan outside Evelyn's house, plate registered to Cross Strategic Services. June 17, David told me never to mention Ashcroft again. I remembered David arriving home that spring with cash he claimed he had won at poker. He used it to catch up our mortgage. 4 months later, I found another hidden credit card, and our marriage entered its final decline. At 9 that morning, my phone displayed a call from an unknown New York number. Miriam motioned for me not to answer. The caller left a voicemail. "Miss Shaw, this is Adrian Cross of Cross, Weller and Finch. A routine genealogy notification involving your daughter has reached one of our clients. These services often overstate relationships, and we would be pleased to help your family avoid unnecessary attention. Please call at your convenience." His voice was warm, concerned, nearly paternal. Miriam saved the recording in 3 places. By noon, we had a plan. We would not contact Conrad directly. We would preserve Sophie's online account, request the raw data and access logs, and arrange an independent chain of custody DNA test through an accredited laboratory. Miriam would petition the probate court under seal for a copy of the registered trust and its annual accountings. We would hire a forensic genealogist and, if the trust existed, a forensic accountant. I made a checklist in a yellow legal pad. Every call would be logged. Every original document would remain secured. No one would post anything online. Sophie would change her passwords and freeze her credit. I would tell my supervisor only that I had a confidential family legal matter. "And David?" Sophie asked. "We do not call him," Miriam said. "Not yet." That was difficult for her. It was difficult for me too. Anger makes confrontation feel like action, but sometimes it is only information given away too early. Adrian Cross did not yet know what my mother had saved. The safest advantage we had was his uncertainty. For the next 3 weeks, we lived 2 lives. In one, I corrected duplicate infusion charges, attended staff meetings, bought groceries, and reminded Sophie to take an umbrella. In the other, I sat with lawyers after work and watched 40 years of silence become evidence. Dr. Leah Park, the genealogist, built family trees from public records without relying on Sophie's consumer result. She compared shared matches and identified clusters from both sides of Conrad's family. Her preliminary conclusion was careful. Sophie was almost certainly a grandchild or equivalent close relative of Conrad. Because Conrad had only one acknowledged child, Thomas, the implication was clear, but science required direct testing. Miriam located my hospital birth record. My mother had listed Thomas Ashcroft as the father, then crossed it out. We also verified that Edwin Cross's secretary had signed for my mother's letter to Conrad. Then the probate court produced the trust accounting. The trust was real. Its reported value was $31.6 million. For 45 years, Cross, Weller, and Finch had charged it annual beneficiary location, identity verification, and special risk fees. The firm certified every year that no qualifying descendant had been found. Yet in 2014, the accounting included a $286,000 payment to a consulting company called Northline Resolution Group. Northline had dissolved 6 months after the payment. Its registered mailing address was a private mailbox in Columbus, Ohio. David had lived 11 miles away. Our forensic accountant, Samuel Ortiz, spoke in the restrained tone of a physician explaining an abnormal scan. One charge alone is not proof, he said, but this account has symptoms. He found that the trust had paid more than $6 million to cross-connected companies. In 2014, the internal code TC17 appeared beside sample procurement, subject resolution, and waiver execution. Waiver execution. I read those words until the letters stopped looking like language. While we waited, Adrian increased the pressure. He sent me a letter on heavy cream paper offering to arrange confidential confirmatory testing at the family's expense. The laboratory he proposed was owned through a chain of companies, partly controlled by an Ashcroft investment fund. Miriam declined. He called my hospital claiming I had used confidential resources in a private inheritance claim. I gave compliance my time logs and device history. They cleared me. Then an anonymous email accused Sophie of falsifying her family medical history. She came home pale and furious. He is trying to make us look dishonest before we ever enter a courtroom. Yes, I said. So we make the record cleaner, not louder. Her form said unknown beside maternal grandfather, which was the truth she knew. The inquiry closed. Each attack was polite enough to deny. Each one consumed time, money, and sleep. That was Adrian's method. He did not need to destroy us if he could make the cost of proceeding feel greater than the value of knowing. One Friday afternoon, he came to Pittsburgh. Miriam had instructed me never to meet him alone, but he did not request a meeting. He appeared on my porch at 6:20, holding no briefcase and wearing a gray raincoat darkened at the shoulders. I saw him through the door camera. He was 63, silver-haired, composed, and familiar in the way public men sometimes are after you have studied too many photographs. Mims. Shaw, he said through the closed door. I apologize for intruding. I hoped we could speak humanly before professionals make that impossible. I called Miriam and placed her on speaker before opening the inner door. The storm door remained locked. Mr. Cross, my lawyer is listening, you may speak. His eyes moved briefly toward the phone in my hand. He recovered with a smile. Of course, your mother was a good woman. My father always spoke respectfully of her. That sentence told me more than he intended. The firm's earlier letter had claimed it possessed no file identifying my mother. What did your father say? I asked. Only that she endured a difficult period with dignity. Did he mention threatening her with a custody investigation? Adrian's expression did not change. Grief can alter how conversations are remembered. We have the recording. For the first time, the rain seemed louder than his voice. He looked past me into the hallway, where my mother's recipe box sat on a table. Then he lowered his tone. Whatever documents Ruth kept, litigation will expose her private life. It will expose yours and Sophie's. Conrad is elderly. His health is fragile. Public accusations could be portrayed as an effort to exploit a grieving man. I would hate to see your daughter begin her career under that kind of scrutiny. It was the same architecture as his father's warning. Concern on the surface, fear carrying the load. Are you offering a threat or advice? I asked. I am offering perspective. Then please send it to Miriam in writing. He sighed as if I had disappointed him. The family is prepared to offer $1.5 million for a full release, without any admission and without requiring further testing. That is enough to secure your daughter's future. If the claim is baseless, why offer anything? Because peace has value, so it's an accurate record. I closed the door. My hands shook afterward, but he did not see them. Courage is not the absence of a physical response. Sometimes it is simply waiting until the dangerous person can no longer use it. 2 days after Adrian's visit, the bank answered Miriam's subpoena. Northline had purchased 3 cashier's checks during the month after it received the trust payment. One went to a private investigator, one went to a genetics laboratory that no longer existed. The third, for $180,000, was payable to David Shaw. The endorsement on the back was his. I had expected anger. What came first was embarrassment. During the divorce, I had insisted that, although David lied about money, he loved Sophie too much to use her. My mother had said only, "I hope you're right." She had known enough to fear the truth and not enough to prove it. Sophie left the room when she saw the check. I found her in the hallway staring at a framed watercolor that had probably hung there for 20 years. "He priced me," she said. "He priced his own silence," I replied. "That is not your value," she cried with the quiet collapse of someone whose childhood memories were being reclassified. I held her and knew no court could reimburse this loss. Miriam added David to the witness list and requested the 2014 laboratory file. The lab's successor company had retained data on backup tape. It showed a cheek swab sample labeled SS, female juvenile, sent by Northline with a reference sample labeled ES. The accompanying report excluded a parent-child relationship between those 2 samples. Adrian had used that report to support a waiver supposedly signed by me. The reference sample was not from Thomas, Conrad, or any Ashcroft. The test answered a question no honest investigator would have asked. The waiver was worse. It stated that my minor child or myself had no Ashcroft connection, released all claims, and accepted $180,000. My name appeared above a signature that looked enough like mine to pass at a glance. But I audit documents for a living. On the displayed date, I had been in a hospital committee meeting whose minutes bore my real signature. The waiver used the rounded E I adopted only after a 2017 wrist injury. Someone had copied a newer signature onto an older document. The metadata confirmed it. The 2014 waiver had been created in 2018 on a firm computer, then inserted into scanned trust records. Samuel found one more detail. The notary stamp belonged to a woman who left the firm in 2016. In a sworn interview, she said she had never met me, had never notarized the waiver, and that her seal had remained in a locked office drawer during her maternity leave. That document was our point of no return. The fabricated waiver meant the concealment was current. Someone expected a challenge and built false evidence in advance. Miriam filed a civil complaint alleging breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, conversion, and civil conspiracy. She also asked the probate judge for an emergency order, freezing extraordinary trust payments and removing Cross, Weller, and Finch from temporary control. The judge scheduled a hearing and authorized formal DNA testing. A hospital technician verified our identities, sealed our kits, and maintained chain of custody. Conrad submitted his sample after his personal attorney, not Adrian, showed him the court papers. That was how we learned Adrian had never told Conrad about Sophie's match. For decades, he had controlled the information reaching his client. He had treated Conrad's grief like an account from which only he could authorize withdrawals. The result arrived 12 days later. Sophie's original match was right that Conrad was her biological grandfather, but the direct comparison produced a 99.97% probability that Conrad, not Thomas, was my biological father. Thomas could not have been my father. My mother's affidavit, the letters, and the trust had pointed to Thomas. Adrian's lawyers claimed she had fabricated the romance, then shifted the allegation after DNA exposed it. They asked the judge to dismiss our complaint and refer us for fraud. Sophie whispered, "But Grandma's photograph, I thought of the young man with my eyes. Then I remembered something a billing mentor had taught me years earlier. When a result contradicts the record, do not force either one to fit. Ask whether the record is describing a different event. We returned to the letters. Most were from Thomas. They were intimate and unmistakably loving, but the final 3, written during the month before his death, repeatedly mentioned a night my mother refused to discuss. One line read, "What father did after the founder's dinner was not your fault, and I will not let his shame become your burden." Another said, "He says he remembers nothing. I remember enough for both of us." My mother had become pregnant after the Ashcroft founder's dinner. Several notebook pages were missing. Under oblique light, an examiner recovered impressions on the remaining sheet. Greenhouse, Conrad would not stop, and Thomas knows. The truth was no longer a hidden romance. It was an assault my mother had spent her life refusing to name. She had loved Thomas. After a company dinner, Conrad assaulted her in the greenhouse. Thomas found her afterward, believed her, and planned to confront his father after his trip. His plane crashed first. My mother had told Edwin Cross that the baby might be Conrad's or Thomas's. Cross had protected the family by allowing everyone, including Conrad, to believe Thomas was the likely father while burying the possibility that his client had assaulted her. The trust's awkward language made sense. It had been designed to protect the child my mother carried without stating what caused the pregnancy. Miriam subpoenaed the confidential memorandum. Adrian said it had been lost in a records flood. Samuel found annual payments for climate-controlled preservation of memorandum originals. The flood had never reached that facility. The judge ordered the warehouse searched by a neutral records officer. The memorandum was found in a box whose inventory page had been altered. It was written by Edwin Cross and signed by Conrad in 1980. In it, Conrad acknowledged an encounter while Ruth was unable or unwilling to consent, stated that Thomas confronted him, and directed that the child be protected. If the child were his, the trust was a moral debt. If Thomas's, it was an inheritance. He had signed it 10 months after I was born. He was my biological father and the man who harmed my mother. His money changed neither fact. Adrian tried to exploit that conflict. Through an intermediary, he offered a private settlement of $12 million if I agreed to seal the memorandum permanently, release the law firm, and sign a public statement saying the relationship had been consensual. That last demand clarified everything. They were not paying for peace. They were trying to purchase a different history. I refused. The preliminary hearing drew reporters despite the sealed filings. Ashcroft Holdings issued a statement calling the matter a private family dispute. Cross, Weller, and Finch said it had served generations of clients with integrity. Anonymous sources described me as an opportunistic hospital clerk who had coached her daughter to target an elderly philanthropist. I wanted to defend myself. Miriam told me that public arguments produce heat, while admissible evidence produces decisions, so I went to work. The trust paid for Adrian's legal defense until Miriam challenged the expense. At a hearing, she placed 2 columns on a screen. The first showed fees for locating a beneficiary. The second showed payments for suppressing that same beneficiary. The same account had financed both. A trustee cannot bill a trust for searching, she said, while paying witnesses and the laboratories to ensure the person found disappears on paper. The judge suspended the firm as trustee and appointed a bank with no Ashcroft relationship. He also ordered expedited discovery and prohibited anyone from contacting my employer or Sophie's school except through counsel. That order gave us room to breathe. David avoided service for 11 days. A process server finally found him leaving a sports bar outside Dayton. He called Sophie that night for the first time in 4 months. She let it go to voicemail. "I made mistakes," he said in the recording. "Your grandmother filled your mother's head with stories. The money was a consulting payment. I was trying to keep our family together." Sophie saved the message and did not call back. In his deposition, David first claimed the $180,000 had been a gambling win. When shown the cashier's check, he said it was payment for introducing Northline to potential clients. When shown his signed consulting agreement, he admitted delivering Sophie's cheek swab, but said he believed it was for an ancestry project. Then Miriam displayed a text message recovered from an old phone backup. It was from Adrian. Once sample confirms no direct match, obtain Evelyn's release. Her signature can be handled if she remains resistant. David stared at the screen for a long time. What did handled mean? Miriam asked. He rubbed his face. I didn't ask. Why not? Because I owed people money. Did Evelyn authorize you to provide Sophie's genetic material? No. Did Evelyn sign the waiver? No. Did you tell Ruth Bell that you had been paid? She figured it out. What did you say to her? He closed his eyes. I told her if she kept digging, Evelyn could lose her house and Sophie would blame her. I watched the deposition from Miriam's office. David did not look evil. He looked smaller than the choices he had made. That did not excuse him. It simply reminded me that large schemes often depend on ordinary people who tell themselves they are committing one survivable wrong. Adrian's deposition took place 2 weeks later in a paneled conference room in New York. He arrived with 3 lawyers, a communications advisor, and the unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to deciding when meetings ended. For the first 2 hours, he remembered almost nothing. Northline had been a vendor selected by others. The internal codes were administrative. The 2018 PDF could have been recreated for digitization. His father's conduct was beyond his knowledge. Miriam did not argue. She moved through dates. Did you certify in 2015 that no potential beneficiary had been located, based on information available to me? Did you authorize payment for sample procurement in 2014? I authorized a vendor. Invoice. Did that vendor obtain Sophie Shaw's DNA? I later learned it may have. Did you receive the laboratory report? I received many reports. She placed an email on the table. Adrian had forwarded the report to himself with the subject line, Ashcroft descendant, containment complete. He said the wording referred to containing legal risk. Miriam showed him the trust's annual search invoices. Each quarter, his firm billed between 28 and 40 hours to locate descendants. The investigator's notes attached to those invoices included my address, workplace, property records, and even photographs from Sophie's middle school graduation. How could your firm certify that no descendant had been found? Miriam asked. While billing the trust to monitor that descendant's home, Adrian leaned back. Potential claimant is not the same as verified beneficiary. Then why did you prevent verification? We did not. She produced his letter offering settlement without further testing. He adjusted his cuff. Miriam then asked about my mother. Adrian repeated that he had no direct knowledge of her. She played the porch recording. Your mother was a good woman. My father always spoke respectfully of her. His lead lawyer objected. The court reporter marked the objection. Miriam showed him a 2014 memo in his handwriting. R. Bell retains originals. Son-in-law cooperative. Avoid direct contact unless documents surface. Who was R. Bell? Adrian looked toward his lawyer. You may answer, the lawyer said. For the first time all day, Adrian's polished rhythm broke. Ruth Bell. What originals did she retain? I did not know. Why did you pay her son-in-law? To resolve a claim. A moment ago you said he was a vendor contact. I may have misunderstood the question. Why did your firm create a backdated waiver? We did not. Miriam placed the notary's affidavit beside the metadata report, then the email about handling my signature. Adrian stared at the 3 documents as if the table itself had betrayed him. Were you protecting Conrad Ashcroft? Miriam asked. Or protecting 45 years of fees obtained by telling him the beneficiary could not be found? The room remained silent. Those were aligned interests, he finally said. It was not a confession in the dramatic sense. He did not shout or pound the table. But in one sentence, he admitted the problem at the center of the case. He had treated a trustee's duty to me as secondary to his firm's interest and his client's reputation. He had converted concealment into professional service. The final evidentiary hearing lasted 6 days. The accredited laboratory director explained the DNA findings in plain language. Dr. Park showed how the independent family tree supported them. The document examiner testified that my signature had been digitally placed on the waiver. The former notary denied witnessing it. Samuel traced $6.4 million in excessive or fraudulent fees and another $3.1 million in investments that benefited entities connected to Adrian's partners. Miriam entered my mother's cassette, under an exception for statements reflecting fear and motive, while the trust documents and later conduct corroborated the substance. The defense fought every inch of it. Some evidence was admitted, some limited, and some excluded. Real courtrooms do not deliver truth in one perfect speech. They construct it under rules, piece by piece, while each side tests whether the pieces can bear weight. David testified under a cooperation agreement. He admitted taking the payment, providing Sophie's sample without my permission, and helping Adrian obtain examples of my signature. He also admitted pressuring my mother. When he looked at Sophie, she looked down. Then Conrad Ashcroft entered the courtroom in a wheelchair. He appeared older than his public photographs, his shoulders narrow inside a dark suit. For most of my life, I had imagined my unknown father as a blank space. Now that space had a face, a history, and a harm my mother had carried alone. Conrad's personal lawyer asked whether he had signed the 1980 memorandum. Yes, he said. Why did you create the trust? His voice was rough. Because Ruth was pregnant, because Thomas believed the child deserved protection, and because I had done something unforgivable. Adrian's lawyer objected to the characterization. The judge allowed the answer. Conrad testified that Edwin Cross told him the baby was probably Thomas's, then later said Ruth had disappeared and wanted no contact. In 1987, he was told testing excluded an Ashcroft relationship. In 2014, Adrian informed him that a final waiver had been obtained. He never saw the actual DNA report and did not know a child's sample had been taken without consent. Did you ever ask to see the evidence? Miriam asked on cross-examination. No, why not? He looked toward me. Because the answer they gave me was easier to live with. That was the most honest thing he said. Miriam asked whether he accepted the accredited result, identifying me as his daughter. I accept it. Do you believe the trust should recognize Evelyn Shaw? Yes. Adrian's attorneys tried to shift blame entirely to Edwin, who had been dead for 14 years. But the 2018 waiver, the 2014 payments, and Adrian's own messages belonged to the present. The story could not be buried with his father. On the last day, the judge delivered findings from the bench. She ruled that I was the intended beneficiary of the trust under both its language and Conrad's memorandum. She found that Cross, Weller, and Finch had breached its fiduciary duties, concealed a known beneficiary, charged fraudulent fee, used unauthorized genetic material, and relied on a forged release. She permanently removed the firm, ordered a full accounting, froze distributions to connected entities, and referred the evidence concerning forgery, obstruction, and unlawful genetic testing to state and federal authorities. She also said something I wrote down. Wealth may purchase complexity, she said, but complexity does not erase duty. The case did not end that afternoon. Cases rarely do. There were appeals, insurance disputes, tax questions, and negotiations over records that had been sealed for decades. Cross, Weller, and Finch eventually settled the civil claims for the return of $6.4 million in fees, additional damages paid by its insurers, and public acknowledgement that the 2014 waiver was invalid. Adrian surrendered his law license while criminal charges involving forgery, obstruction, and conspiracy were pending. Northline's former investigator pleaded guilty to unlawful acquisition of genetic information and agreed to cooperate. David was not imprisoned. He pleaded to a lesser privacy-related offense, repaid the portion of money he still possessed, and accepted 5 years of probation. Some people thought that was too lenient. Perhaps it was. Justice and emotional repair are not the same system, and neither balances perfectly. The independently managed trust, after fees, restitution, and tax planning, was valued at just over $38 million. I did not receive it in one dramatic check. The court approved a structured distribution, independent oversight, and protections for Sophie. I kept working while the appeals were pending. On the morning the first distribution cleared, I was reviewing a claim for a retired teacher whose insurer had denied a necessary infusion because of one incorrect code. I corrected the code and called her. That felt more real than the number in my account. I paid off my house, Sophie's tuition, and the remaining small debts my divorce had left behind. I established a patient billing advocacy fund at the hospital so families could get help before errors became collections. In my mother's name, we created scholarships for single parents entering bookkeeping, nursing, and legal support programs. I bought no mansion. The following spring, I sold our narrow brick house, only because every passing sedan still made Sophie look toward the window. We moved to a smaller town 40 minutes outside Pittsburgh, into a cedar-sided home with good locks, wide windows, and a yard large enough for lavender, tomatoes, and one stubborn pear tree. I kept my job 3 days a week. On Fridays, I volunteered with a nonprofit that helped older patients read medical bills. Money had given me choices, but useful work still gave my days a shape. Sophie finished nursing school. At graduation, there was an empty chair where David might have sat. She had not forgiven him. I told her forgiveness was not a debt she had to pay on anyone else's schedule. Conrad and I did not become a perfect father and daughter. There was no music, no embrace that repaired 46 years, and no version of the story in which his regret erased what he did to my mother. He asked to meet me after the case. We sat in a private room at a quiet hotel. He brought a box containing Thomas's engineering sketches, childhood photographs, and the letters my mother had sent that Edwin intercepted. He did not ask me to call him Dad. Ruth deserved better from all of us, he said. She deserved to be believed the first time. He nodded. I asked why he had funded a trust instead of finding her himself. Cordis, he said, delegated to professionals and renamed discretion. That answer did not win affection, but it gave me something more useful than performance, accountability. We met several more times before his health declined. He told me about Thomas, how he redesigned furnace guards after a worker lost 3 fingers, how he hated neckties, how he carried peppermints for children. Those stories belonged to my mother, too. Hearing them allowed the young man in the photograph to become more than a tragedy. Conrad placed a portion of his personal estate into a foundation for workplace safety and survivor legal services. I agreed to advise it only if its board remained independent and no building carried my name. He accepted those terms. 6 months later, he died. I attended the funeral with Sophie and sat in the 3rd row, neither hidden nor displayed. Reporters waited outside. We left through a side door and drove home in the rain. That evening, Sophie and I planted the last of my mother's lavender along our new porch. The soil was dark and cold. My hands smelled of earth. For the first time since the DNA alert, a black car slowed near the house, and neither of us looked up. People sometimes ask whether learning the truth made me wish my mother had told me sooner. The honest answer is yes. I wish she had trusted me with my own history. I wish fear had not been allowed to shape our family for 4 decades. But I also understand the world in which she made her choices. She was 19, grieving, pregnant, and facing men who knew how to make power sound like procedure. She preserved what she could. She documented dates. She kept letters. She left a path for me when she could not walk it herself. Her silence hurt me. Her evidence saved me. Both things can be true. I also learned that respectable language does not guarantee respectable conduct. A threat can arrive as concern. A bribe can be called peace. A forged history can sit in an expensive binder and still be false. When someone pressures you to decide quickly, to keep a matter private, or to trust reputation over records, slow down. Write down the date. Save the message. Ask for the document. Let qualified people test the claim. Do not confuse calmness with surrender. I never outshouted Adrian Cross. I outlasted the version of events he could not support. The money changed our security, but it was never the most important recovery. The true inheritance was my mother's voice on an old cassette, my daughter's belief that her identity could not be sold, and the knowledge that our family story no longer belonged to the people who had hidden it. Every life has records others hope no one will reconcile. Sometimes healing begins when one patient person finally compares the dates. If your daughter's DNA test uncovered a powerful family secret and the people involved offered you money to stay silent, what would you have done?